Cities don't happen by accident. Every street, every neighborhood, every mile of infrastructure is the result of decisions made long before we ever lived there. In this channel, we don't chase headlines or quick opinions. We slow down. We look at history, design, and the systems beneath the surface. Because to understand cities, you first have to understand the choices that shaped them. Imagine standing in the center of an American city. Not in front of a skyscraper, not inside a historic square, but in a parking lot. Acres of asphalt, heat rising, white lines fading. No trees, no people, no memory. Now here's the question most Americans never ask. Why does so much of our land exist purely to store empty cars? This wasn't random, it wasn't accidental, and it wasn't inevitable. Parking lots are one of the most powerful and least discussed forces shaping American cities. Real estate prices, walkability, climate impact, and even social behavior. Tonight, we're uncovering how they came to dominate the American landscape, who benefited, and what they quietly replaced.
Before cars ruled the city, what American urban space used to be. The city before asphalt. To understand why parking lots exist everywhere in America, we have to begin with something that feels almost unfamiliar today, the pre-automobile American city. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, American cities were compact, dense, and intensely human-scaled. Streets were not traffic corridors, they were social spaces. Cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, St. Louis, and San Francisco were designed around walking, streetcars, and proximity. Daily life happened within a narrow radius. Homes sat above shops, offices stood beside markets, schools, churches, and theaters were woven into the same blocks. Land was too valuable to waste. Every square foot had a purpose. Streets were not just for movement. Early American streets served multiple functions simultaneously: transportation, commerce, social interaction, informal play, political gatherings. Children played in them, vendors sold food, neighbors talked, trolleys passed through slowly. There was no assumption that streets belonged primarily to vehicles. In fact, the idea would have sounded strange. The street was public life itself. Density was a feature, not a problem. Before cars, density wasn't feared, it was necessary. Buildings were close because walking was the default. Distance was expensive. Time mattered. Energy mattered. This density supported local businesses, public transit viability, social interaction, economic efficiency. Parking, as a concept, barely existed. Horses required stables, yes, but they were typically located off-site, behind buildings, or integrated into service alleys. They did not consume the primary urban frontage. No city would have demolished valuable downtown blocks to store horses. The value of land was obvious. Land in cities was precious. Everyone understood this instinctively. A single city block could generate housing, tax revenue, jobs, social activity. To leave it empty would have seemed irrational. And yet today, many American downtowns dedicate 30 to 60% of their surface area to parking. That reversal did not happen naturally. The automobile arrives, quietly at first. When cars first appeared in American cities in the early 1900s, they were novelties, toys for the wealthy. Cities were not redesigned for them. Cars adapted to cities, not the other way around. Drivers navigated crowded streets filled with pedestrians, carts, bicycles, and streetcars. Speeds were low, accidents were common, and cars were widely viewed as dangerous intrusions. Public opinion was not on the automobile side. In many cities, early traffic laws actually restricted cars to protect pedestrians. A critical misunderstanding. Here's the key point most histories gloss over. American cities were not broken by congestion. They were broken by policy choices. Congestion existed, yes, but it existed because streets were doing what they were designed to do: host life. The automobile didn't solve a problem. It redefined what the problem was. The language shift that changed everything. One of the most powerful transformations was linguistic. Pedestrians were reframed as jaywalkers, streets became roads, public space became right-of-way. This shift was not accidental. Automobile interests actively promoted the idea that streets existed primarily for cars, and that anyone else using them was in the way. Once this idea took hold, everything else followed. The first parking conflicts. As car ownership increased in the 1910s and 1920s, cities faced a new issue. Cars needed somewhere to stop. At first, parking was informal. Cars lined curbs, streets clogged, businesses complained. But the solution was not yet demolition. Cities experimented with time-limited curb parking, shared garages, private lots behind buildings. The idea of removing entire neighborhoods for parking would have seemed extreme. That idea would come later. The economic temptation. As cars multiplied, landowners noticed something important.
Parking generated predictable income with minimal maintenance. No tenants, no plumbing, no elevators, no complaints, just asphalt and lines. For short-term profit, parking lots made sense, especially during economic downturns. And once a building was demolished, rebuilding became unlikely. Parking, in many cases, was meant to be temporary. It rarely was. The first urban erasures. By the 1930s and 1940s, parking began quietly replacing buildings in American downtowns. Not all at once, not dramatically. One building here, one block there. Often in working-class neighborhoods, often near transit hubs. Entire communities vanished, not for skyscrapers, but for empty space. What was lost was not just buildings.
Housing, local businesses, social networks, street life, tax base. But these losses were gradual, dispersed, and easy to overlook. Parking did not look violent. It looked practical. The illusion of convenience. Parking promised something seductive: convenience. Drive anywhere, stop anywhere, leave any time. But convenience for individuals came at enormous collective cost. Cities quietly traded density for emptiness, productivity for storage, community for circulation. And this trade would accelerate dramatically after World War II. That is where the real transformation begins.
The moment parking became mandatory, how policy locked asphalt into American cities. The post-war turning point. If parking lots were quietly appearing before World War II, the post-war era is when they became structural. This is the moment when parking stopped being optional and started being required by law. The transformation did not come from public demand alone. It came from a powerful combination of policy, fear, optimism, and economic ideology. America emerged from World War II with unprecedented industrial capacity, rising incomes, and a deep belief in progress through technology. The automobile became the symbol of that belief. Cars as freedom, not infrastructure. In post-war America, the car was not treated as a transportation tool. It was treated as personal freedom. Advertising framed driving as independence. Suburbs were marketed as escape. Speed meant success. And critically, cities were expected to adapt to cars, not the other way around. This assumption shaped every planning decision that followed. The birth of minimum parking requirements. One of the most consequential planning tools in American history sounds deceptively boring: minimum parking requirements. Beginning in the 1940s and spreading rapidly in the 1950s and 1960s, cities across the United States began rewriting zoning codes to mandate a minimum number of parking spaces for nearly every type of building. Not maximums, not recommendations, minimums. A restaurant needed a certain number of spaces per seat. An apartment needed spaces per unit. An office needed spaces per square foot. These numbers were often not based on empirical studies. They were copied from other cities, trade manuals, or suburban assumptions. Once written into law, they became unquestionable. Why cities did this? City leaders believed they were solving congestion. More parking, they assumed, would reduce traffic caused by drivers circling for spaces. But this logic ignored a crucial reality. Parking availability does not reduce driving demand. It increases it. When parking is abundant and free, people drive more. Yet at the time, this relationship was poorly understood and politically inconvenient. Parking as a hidden subsidy. Minimum parking requirements effectively subsidized car ownership. Developers were forced to provide parking, regardless of whether users needed it or not. The cost of parking construction was hidden inside: higher rents, higher home prices, lower density buildings. Even people without cars paid for parking through increased costs. But because the cost was invisible, it was rarely questioned. The geometry of destruction. Parking takes space, far more than most people realize. A single parking space requires not just the stall, but drive aisles, turning radii, ramps, and setbacks. In urban terms, parking is spatially inefficient. Once minimums were imposed, buildings were forced apart. Density collapsed. Mixed-use development became harder. Small lots became undevelopable. Historic buildings became non-conforming. Parking did not just occupy land, it reshaped the entire urban fabric. Downtowns begin to hollow out. As suburban shopping centers with massive parking fields emerged, downtowns faced pressure to compete. Rather than doubling down on walkability and transit, many cities chose the same strategy: demolish buildings for parking. Entire blocks were cleared to create surface lots. Ironically, this made downtowns less attractive. With fewer buildings, fewer people lived and worked there. With fewer people, businesses struggled. With struggling businesses, more demolition followed. Parking fed decline. The parking feedback loop. A destructive loop formed.
More driving created demand for more parking. More parking reduced density. Lower density increased driving. Each step reinforced the next. By the 1970s, many American cities had more parking spaces than people. This was not accidental inefficiency. It was the logical outcome of policy. Why no one questioned it? Parking requirements were politically safe. Removing them risked backlash from drivers. Maintaining them satisfied suburban commuters. Challenging them required technical knowledge few elected officials had. Parking also benefited powerful interests: automobile manufacturers, oil companies, suburban developers, retail chains. The costs were spread thinly across the public. The benefits were concentrated. The cultural shift becomes permanent. Over time, Americans came to expect parking everywhere. A building without parking was seen as flawed. A street without curb access felt incomplete. The idea that land could serve people instead of cars faded. Parking was no longer a solution. It was an assumption. What was never calculated? What cities failed to calculate was opportunity cost. What else could that land have been? Housing, parks, offices, schools, public squares.
Once asphalt replaced buildings, reclaiming that space became politically and financially difficult. Parking lots froze cities in low productivity states, a planning mistake disguised as neutrality. Minimum parking requirements were framed as neutral technical rules. In reality, they encoded a specific vision of society. Everyone drives, land is abundant, density is undesirable, public life is secondary. This vision reshaped America for generations, and it would soon intersect with something even larger, the interstate highway system. That intersection changed everything.
Asphalt and power: how parking lots became tools of urban renewal and displacement. The highway era begins. By the time minimum parking requirements were firmly embedded in American zoning codes, another force arrived to accelerate the transformation of cities: the interstate highway system. In 1956, the Federal Aid Highway Act committed the United States to building over 40,000 miles of highways. Officially, the system was framed as a matter of national defense and economic efficiency. In practice, it became one of the most powerful urban restructuring tools in history. Highways needed land, parking needed land. Cities had both, and planners were willing to take it. Urban renewal as a planning doctrine. The term urban renewal sounds constructive. In reality, it often meant demolition. Federal programs offered cities funding to clear what planners labeled blighted areas. These neighborhoods were frequently dense, mixed-use, and economically active, but they did not fit post-war planning ideals. They were also disproportionately working class, immigrant, black, minority communities. Once labeled blighted, these areas could be erased. Parking as the silent partner. While highways cut through cities visibly, parking operated more quietly. Highways created destinations separated by distance. Parking made those destinations accessible by car. Together, they formed a system. After a neighborhood was demolished for a highway interchange, the surrounding parcels often became surface parking lots, not temporarily, permanently. Parking absorbed land that might otherwise have been rebuilt. Why parking was preferred over housing? Rebuilding housing required financing, long-term management, political negotiation. Parking required none of these. A cleared lot could immediately generate revenue. No tenants, no risk. For cities facing shrinking tax bases and rising infrastructure costs, parking looked like pragmatism. But pragmatism had consequences. Displacement without return. Urban renewal promised replacement housing. It rarely delivered it. Communities displaced for highways and parking lots were often scattered, not relocated. Social networks dissolved. Local economies vanished. Cultural memory was erased. Parking lots preserved none of it. The false neutrality of asphalt. Parking appeared neutral. It was not housing versus no housing. It was just empty space. But neutrality was an illusion. Every parking lot represented a decision: cars over people, storage over activity, access for commuters over life for residents. These decisions shaped cities long after planners moved on. Downtowns become transfer points. By the 1970s and 1970s, many American downtowns stopped functioning as places to live. They became places to arrive, park, work briefly, and leave.
Office towers rose, isolated by seas of parking. After business hours, streets emptied. Urban life flattened into a schedule. Parking made this possible. The economics of emptiness. Parking lots generate less tax revenue per acre than almost any other land use. Yet cities continue to favor them. Why? Because short-term fiscal stability mattered more than long-term productivity. Parking offered predictable income without political conflict. It was a low-effort solution to complex urban problems. The psychological impact. As parking replaced buildings, people perceived downtowns as unsafe and uninviting. Empty space discouraged walking. Walking discouraged business. Business decline justified more parking. Aesthetic degradation became economic logic. Who benefited? The system rewarded those who did not live in cities. Suburban commuters gained easy access. Retail chains gained standardized access models. Developers gained simplified construction rules. Urban residents paid the cost. The racial geography of parking. Parking did not just reshape land, it reshaped social boundaries. Neighborhoods cleared for highways and parking lots were often buffers between downtowns and minority communities. Asphalt became a tool of separation. Physical distance replaced social integration. What was never measured? Urban renewal measured. Cars moved. Parking spaces added. Land cleared. It did not measure community cohesion, cultural loss, long-term inequality. Parking made loss invisible. A system locked in. By the late 1970s, the damage was done. Cities had spread. Transit had weakened. Parking was mandatory. Undoing the system would require confronting decades of assumptions. Most cities chose not to. The result was a landscape dominated by asphalt, not because it worked, but because it was already there.
When buildings stepped back, how parking reshaped American architecture. Architecture learns to serve the car. Once parking became mandatory, architecture followed. Not gradually, not subtly. Buildings across America began to change shape, orientation, and purpose, not in response to climate, culture, or human scale, but to accommodate automobiles. This shift fundamentally altered what American buildings looked like and how they functioned. The end of the continuous street wall. Before cars dominated, buildings met the street. Doors opened directly onto sidewalks. Windows engaged pedestrians. Storefronts competed for attention. Parking broke this relationship. Zoning codes now required setbacks, not for light or air, but for vehicle storage. Buildings stepped back. Parking moved forward. The street lost its edge. Front doors disappear. As parking moved to the front, entrances followed the car. Main doors faced lots instead of sidewalks. Pedestrians were relegated to side paths, if they existed at all. Architecture stopped speaking to people. It began speaking to windshields. The rise of the pad site. Commercial architecture adapted with ruthless efficiency. Retail buildings shrank to simple boxes, surrounded by parking on all sides. These were not meant to belong to a place. They were meant to be accessible from anywhere. Pad sites, standalone buildings in parking fields, became the default form of American retail. Local variation disappeared. Standardization replaces identity. Parking requirements favored large parcels. Small lots became difficult to develop. Historic buildings became incompatible. This encouraged consolidation. National chains thrived. Local businesses struggled. Architecture became standardized, repeatable, and interchangeable. A store in Arizona looked like a store in Ohio. Place lost meaning. Setbacks and the death of spatial intimacy. Setbacks created distance.
Distance reduced visual interest. Reduced interest discouraged walking. Less walking justified more parking. Buildings became isolated objects instead of participants in a street ecosystem. The urban experience flattened. Vertical growth is penalized. Parking is horizontally expensive. To provide required spaces, developers often sacrificed height. Instead of building up, cities spread out. Density fell. Transit weakened. Driving increased. Architecture adapted by becoming shorter, wider, and less expressive. The parking garage compromise. Where land was too valuable for surface parking, garages appeared. But garages imposed their own architectural costs. Blank walls replaced windows. Dead zones replaced storefronts. Active uses were pushed upward or inward. The street suffered. Residential architecture transforms. Parking requirements changed housing as well. Apartment buildings required off-street spaces, often 1 or 2 per unit. This increased construction costs and reduced unit counts. Affordable housing became harder to build. Many projects became financially impossible. Parking quietly limited who could live in cities. The suburban model goes everywhere. Design principles once associated with suburbs migrated into urban cores. Driveways replaced alleys. Garages dominated facades. Curb cuts multiplied. Streets became fragmented and hostile. The line between city and suburb blurred, not by improving suburbs, but by suburbanizing treaties. Architectural creativity constrained. Parking requirements reduced design flexibility. Architects worked backwards from space counts. Creativity became secondary to compliance. Buildings were not designed for people first. They were designed for code. The psychological impact of parking-dominated design. Parking-heavy architecture communicates emptiness. Large lots create visual fatigue. Blank facades discourage exploration. Cities feel larger but offer less. People move through them instead of inhabiting them. What was lost? In adapting to parking, architecture surrendered. With street engagement? With spatial richness? With local character? With social interaction? The built environment became less human and less memorable. A built form that reinforces behavior. Architecture does not just reflect behavior. It shapes it. Parking first design reinforces driving. Driving reinforces sprawl. Sprawl reinforces parking demand. The cycle is physical, and it is difficult to break.
The high cost of free parking. Who pays for the asphalt economy? The myth of free parking. To most Americans, parking feels free. You pull in, you leave the car, you walk away. No ticket, no transaction. But free parking is an illusion. Parking is never free. It is simply paid for indirectly, and often inefficiently. Understanding who pays reveals why parking has been so difficult to challenge. The hidden cost structure. Every parking space carries real costs: land acquisition, construction, maintenance, lighting, drainage, insurance. A single surface space can cost thousands of dollars. A structured garage space can cost tens of thousands. These costs do not disappear. They are absorbed into higher retail prices, higher rents, higher home prices, lower wages. Everyone pays, including people who do not drive. Parking as a regressive system. Parking subsidies disproportionately benefit higher-income households. Car ownership correlates with income, yet parking costs are embedded in goods and housing universally. Low-income households subsidize infrastructure they may not use. This regressive structure rarely enters public debate. The development constraint. Minimum parking requirements act as a tax on development. Projects must allocate land to storage instead of productivity. In many cases, parking costs exceed the cost of the building itself. Developers respond by building fewer units, raising prices, abandoning projects entirely. Housing supply shrinks. Affordability worsens.
why retail loves parking, and why it's misleading. Retailers often argue parking is essential for business. In suburban contexts, this is partially true. But in urban areas, studies repeatedly show that walkable environments generate more foot traffic. Foot traffic spends more cumulatively than drivers. Street life increases dwell time. Parking prioritizes convenience over value creation. Parking and municipal budgets. Cities often underestimate parking's fiscal drag. Surface parking generates minimal tax revenue per acre, yet it consumes street infrastructure, stormwater systems, enforcement resources. The return on investment is poor. Dense development consistently outperforms parking fiscally. Opportunity cost, the missing math. What parking replaces matters more than what it provides. An acre of downtown land used for parking could host hundreds of housing units, offices and jobs, public space, tax-generating uses. Parking freezes land into its lowest productive state. Cities rarely calculate this loss explicitly. The self-reinforcing subsidy. Because parking is subsidized, driving appears cheaper than it truly is. This distorts transportation choices. Transit appears inefficient. Walking appears inconvenient. Driving appears rational. Policy creates behavior. Behavior justifies policy. The real estate signal problem. Parking requirements send a signal to markets. Cars are expected. Driving is assumed. Alternative modes are secondary. Investors build accordingly. Once capital adapts to this assumption, reversing it becomes risky. The environmental ledger. Parking is not environmentally neutral. Asphalt increases heat. Runoff pollutes waterways. Low density increases emissions. Yet environmental costs are externalized. They do not appear on balance sheets. Why reform is politically difficult. Removing parking subsidies challenges deeply held expectations. Drivers fear inconvenience. Businesses fear loss. Politicians fear backlash. Yet when cities do reform parking, the results often contradict fears. But evidence competes poorly with habit. Parking as an economic inertia machine. Once built, parking demands justification. Empty lots feel wasteful, so cities attract driving to fill them. The infrastructure dictates behavior. This is not market efficiency. It is sunk cost logic. The unspoken truth. Parking persists not because it works well, but because it spreads its costs invisibly. No single bill arrives. No single vote created it. The asphalt economy thrives on fragmentation. Understanding this is the first step toward change.
Cities built for leaving. How parking changed everyday American life. Distance becomes normal. One of the most profound impacts of parking is not physical, it is psychological. As parking spread, Americans became accustomed to distance. Walking a few blocks began to feel far. Crossing large lots felt expected. Driving became the default, even for short trips. The built environment trained behavior. The fragmentation of daily life. Before parking dominated cities, daily activities overlapped spatially. Work, shopping, socializing, and living happened within close proximity. Parking separated them. Each destination required its own lot. Each trip required a car. Each activity became isolated. Life became a sequence of arrivals and departures. Walking becomes optional, then uncomfortable. Parking first design deprioritized pedestrians. Sidewalks narrowed or disappeared. Crossings lengthened. Distances expanded. Walking became slower, less safe, less pleasant. Not because people disliked walking, but because cities discouraged it. Transit suffers indirectly. Public transit depends on density. Parking reduces density. As land was consumed by lots, fewer people lived near stations. Ridership declined. Service weakened. Driving appeared more convenient. Parking did not kill transit directly. It made transit financially unsustainable. The social cost of isolation. Parking reshaped social interaction. Streets lost casual encounters. Businesses lost spontaneous customers.
Neighborhoods lost shared spaces. Social life moved indoors or online. The city became a network of private interiors connected by vehicles. Children and independence. Parking-heavy environments reduced childhood independence. Long distances and fast-moving traffic limited safe movement. Children were driven rather than walking. Autonomy shrank. Urban design shaped upbringing. The perception of safety. Empty spaces feel unsafe. Parking lots at night discourage activity. Lack of eyes on the street increases fear. Ironically, parking built for convenience often reduced perceived safety. Time as a cost. Driving requires time. Parking requires searching, walking, waiting. Cities optimized for cars often increased total travel time. What felt efficient individually became inefficient collectively. The ritual of arrival and exit. American urban life became defined by parking rituals. Pull in. Lock the car. Walk across asphalt. Reverse the process. This ritual replaced street engagement. Arrival replaced presence. Health implications. Reduced walking has health consequences. Sedentary behavior increased. Incidental movement declined. Parking influenced public health quietly. Normalization of emptiness. Perhaps the most subtle change is aesthetic tolerance. Americans grew accustomed to vast empty spaces. What once felt strange became normal. Parking redefined expectations of urban form. Behavior follows design. People do not choose driving in a vacuum. They respond to environments. When cities are built for cars, driving is rational. Parking does not just enable behavior, it scripts it. A city optimized for motion, not life. The result is a city that moves people efficiently, but struggles to hold them. Places become pass-through zones. Memory weakens. Belonging fades. Parking did not just reshape cities, it reshaped daily life.
Why parking never leaves. Fear, politics, and urban inertia. Parking as political ground. By the time the social and economic effects of parking were visible, parking had already become untouchable. Not because it was beloved, but because it was expected. In American cities, parking is not just infrastructure, it is political terrain. Any proposal to remove or reduce it triggers anxiety. The fear of absence. The strongest resistance to parking reform is not opposition, it is fear. Fear that customers will disappear. Fear that traffic will worsen. Fear that access will be lost. These fears persist even when evidence suggests otherwise. Parking feels like insurance. Drivers as the silent majority. Most Americans drive daily. They need not organize around parking, but they notice when it changes. Elected officials understand this intuitively. Protecting parking is often seen as protecting votes. Business resistance and the visibility problem. Businesses often equate parking with survival. A full parking lot feels like success. An empty one feels like failure. Street activity is harder to measure. Visual cues matter in politics. Parking looks like access. Institutional memory and planning culture. Planning departments are conservative by design. Codes are inherited. Standards persist. Innovation carries risk. Parking requirements became professional defaults. Questioning them requires effort and political cover. The risk asymmetry. Removing parking carries visible risk. Keeping parking carries invisible cost. Political systems favor visible stability over long-term gain. Parking persists because its damage is diffuse. Lawsuits and liability. Parking is tied to liability concerns. Cities fear being blamed for congestion or inconvenience. Providing parking feels defensive. No one gets sued for too much parking. The myth of readiness. Cities often claim they are not ready to reduce parking. Readiness becomes an excuse for inaction. Parking reform is perpetually postponed.
The transitional trap. Partial reforms create awkward transitions. During change, benefits lag behind disruption. This fuels backlash. Many cities retreat before reforms mature. Parking as emotional infrastructure. Parking connects to identity. Driving symbolizes independence. Parking symbolizes access. Challenging parking feels personal. The illusion of neutral compromise. Cities often compromise by adding structured parking. This preserves car access while increasing cost. The underlying assumptions remain untouched. Institutional momentum. Once parking infrastructure exists, it demands justification. Removing it requires admitting past mistakes. Institutions resist at admission. Why evidence struggles to win. Data is abstract. Habit is concrete. Parking reform requires trust, and trust is fragile. Change requires reframing. Successful reform reframes parking not as removal, but as reallocation. Space for people. Space for value. Without reframing, resistance dominates. Parking persists because it feels safe, not because it works.
When asphalt was questioned, cities that rewrote the parking rules. The first cracks in the system. Parking dominance did not collapse suddenly. It weakened quietly. In the late 20th century, a small number of cities began questioning assumptions that had gone unchallenged for decades. Not out of ideology, but necessity. Land was scarce. Housing costs were rising. Downtowns were underperforming. Parking, once seen as solution, began to look like a constraint. Removing minimums, a radical idea. The most consequential reform was deceptively simple: removing minimum parking requirements. Instead of mandating how much parking must be built, cities allowed developers to decide. This shifted parking from a legal requirement to a market choice. The results surprised many. Early urban experiments. Cities with strong transit and compact cores were the first to act. Downtown districts removed or reduced parking minimums. Developers responded cautiously, then confidently. Parking did not disappear. It adjusted. What actually happened? Contrary to fears, buildings were still leased, businesses still opened, streets did not collapse. In many cases, housing units increased, construction costs dropped, older buildings became viable again. Parking had been suppressing activity. Adaptive reuse accelerates. Historic buildings without parking suddenly made sense. Warehouses became apartments. Offices became mixed use. Preservation became financially possible. Parking reform unlocked latent urban value. Shared parking emerges. Without rigid requirements, parking became shared. Office parking served residents at night. Retail parking served events. Efficiency replaced excess. The street responds. Reduced parking demand allowed streets to change. Curb space became outdoor seating, bike lanes, transit lanes, loading zones. Street life returned. The economic signal changes. Removing minimums sent a new signal. Cars are optional. People are valuable. Investment followed. Transit strengthens indirectly. As density increased, transit ridership stabilized. Service became more viable. Driving was no longer assumed. Managing transition pain. Reform was not frictionless. Some areas experienced confusion. Some drivers complained. But over time, patterns adjusted. Cities that stayed committed saw benefits compound. Lessons from failure. Where reforms failed, the issue was rarely parking itself. It was incomplete planning, weak transit, poor communication, abrupt enforcement. Parking reform is not isolated policy. It is part of a system. The role of data. Successful cities measured outcomes. They tracked occupancy, turnover, pricing. Data replaced fear. Parking as choice, not entitlement. The most important shift was philosophical. Parking became a choice, not a right. This reframing changed public conversation. The proof of concept exists. Parking reform is no longer theoretical. It has been tested. The results are uneven, but clear. Cities are not broken without mandatory parking. They often function berserk.
When asphalt was questioned, cities that rewrote the parking rules. The first cracks in the system. Parking dominance did not collapse suddenly. It weakened quietly. In the late 20th century, a small number of cities began questioning assumptions that had gone unchallenged for decades. Not out of ideology, but necessity. Land was scarce. Housing costs were rising. Downtowns were underperforming. Parking, once seen as solution, began to look like constraint. Removing minimums, a radical idea. The most consequential reform was deceptively simple. Removing minimum parking requirements. Instead of mandating how much parking must be built, cities allowed developers to decide. This shifted parking from a legal requirement to a market choice.
The results surprised many. Early urban experiments. Cities with strong transit and compact cores were the first to act. Downtown districts removed or reduced parking minimums. Developers responded cautiously, then confidently. Parking did not disappear. It adjusted. What actually happened? Contrary to fears, buildings were still leased. Businesses still opened. Streets did not collapse. In many cases, housing units increased. Construction costs dropped. Older buildings became viable again. Parking had been suppressing activity. Adaptive reuse accelerates. Historic buildings without parking suddenly made sense. Warehouses became apartments. Offices became mixed use. Preservation became financially possible. Parking reform unlocked latent urban value. Shared parking emerges. Without rigid requirements, parking became shared. Office parking served residents at night. Retail parking served events. Efficiency replaced excess. The street responds. Reduced parking demand allowed streets to change. Curb space became outdoor seating, bike lanes, transit lanes, loading zones. Street life returned. The economic signal changes. Removing minimums sent a new signal. Cars are optional. People are valuable. Investment followed. Transit strengthens indirectly. As density increased, transit ridership stabilized. Service became more viable. Driving was no longer assumed. Managing transition pain. Reform was not frictionless. Some areas experienced confusion. Some drivers complained. But over time, patterns adjusted. Cities that stayed committed saw benefits compound. Lessons from failure. Where reforms failed, the issue was rarely parking itself. It was incomplete planning, weak transit, poor communication, abrupt enforcement. Parking reform is not isolated policy. It is part of a system. The role of data. Successful cities measured outcomes. They tracked occupancy, turnover, pricing. Data replaced fear. Parking as choice, not entitlement. The most important shift was philosophical. Parking became a choice, not a right. This reframing changed public conversation. The proof of concept exists. Parking reform is no longer theoretical. It has been tested. The results are uneven, but clear. Cities are not broken without mandatory parking. They often function better.
Two futures of the American city: if parking stays, and if it doesn't. The path of inertia. If current parking patterns remain unchanged, the future of many American cities is already visible. It looks like rising housing costs, widening distance between destinations, increasing infrastructure maintenance burdens, declining downtown productivity. Parking consumes land faster than cities can afford. The maintenance trap. Parking lots age. Asphalt cracks. Drainage fails. Lighting deteriorates. Maintenance costs accumulate. Unlike buildings, parking does not appreciate. Cities inherit liabilities without value growth. Climate pressure increases. Large parking surfaces amplify heat. Stormwater runoff worsens flooding. Climate adaptation becomes harder in low-density landscapes. Parking limits resilience. Fiscal stress compounds. Low-density development generates insufficient tax revenue to maintain infrastructure. Cities face budget shortfalls. Services decline. Parking-heavy cities struggle to sustain themselves. The decline of optional driving. Ironically, even car-centric systems become inefficient as congestion rises. Driving loses its advantage. Parking no longer guarantees convenience. The alternative path emerges. In cities that reallocate parking space, a different trajectory appears. Land becomes productive. Density increases. Choices expand. Incremental change, not erasure. The alternative future is not car-free. It is flexible. Parking exists where needed, but no longer dominates. Rebuilding urban continuity. Replacing parking lots with buildings restores street networks. Shorter distances encourage walking. Activity clusters. The city regains coherence. Economic resilience improves. More people per acre means higher tax revenue, better service efficiency, diversified economies,
Cities stabilize. Environmental gains multiply. Reduced asphalt lowers heat. Green infrastructure fits. Emissions decline indirectly. Social life returns. When space serves people, interaction increases. Public life strengthens. Belonging grows. The psychological shift. As expectations change, resistance fades. What once felt risky becomes normal. Cities recalibrate. Time as the critical variable. Change is slow, but cumulative. Each parking lot redeveloped alters the system. The future is shaped by sequence, not revolution. The cost of waiting. Delay has consequences. Every year of inaction locks in inefficiency. Parking is not neutral over time. Choice remains. The future of American cities is not predetermined. It is regulated. Parking policy decides more than where cars sit. It decides what cities become.
Parking was a decision, and so is the future. Seeing the pattern clearly. When you step back far enough, the story of parking in America becomes clear. Parking was never just about cars. It was about priorities. Every parking lot represents a choice, repeated thousands of times, across decades, reinforced by law, culture, and habit. Those choices accumulated into a landscape. Parking as a historical artifact. Parking lots are off. Parking was a decision, and so is the future. Seeing the pattern clearly. When you step back far enough, the story of parking in America becomes clear. Parking was never just about cars. It was about priorities. Every parking lot represents a choice, repeated thousands of times, across decades, reinforced by law, culture, and habit. Those choices accumulated into a landscape. Parking as a historical artifact. Parking lots are often treated as neutral infrastructure. In reality, they are historical artifacts. They reflect a specific moment in American thinking. Faith in unlimited land. Belief in technological solutions. Preference for speed over presence. Assumption that growth meant outward expansion. Parking is not timeless. It is dated. What parking replaced? Every parking lot sits on top of something that used to exist. A building, a street, a neighborhood, a memory. Cities did not grow around parking. Parking grew by removing cities. Design is never neutral. Urban design expresses values. When space is dedicated to cars, it communicates. Movement matters more than place. Storage matters more than activity. Arrival matters more than staying. Cities absorbed these messages. People adapted. The long shadow of regulation. Minimum parking requirements did more than mandate spaces. They standardized assumptions. They taught generations of planners, architects, developers, and citizens to treat parking as inevitable. Once embedded, inevitability feels natural. Why this conversation matters now? For most of the 20th century, America could afford inefficiency. Land was cheap. Energy was cheap. Climate costs were ignored. That era is ending. Cities are being asked to do more with less. Parking-heavy urbanism struggles under these demands. The question is not anti-car. This conversation is often misunderstood. The question is not whether cars belong in cities. They do. The question is whether cars deserve priority over everything else. Parking answers that question implicitly. Choice, not erasure. Reducing parking does not mean banning driving. It means restoring balance. It means allowing cities to decide how space is used, rather than letting inherited rules decide for them. The slow reversal already underway. Across the country, changes are happening quietly. A lot redeveloped here. A minimum removed there. A street reclaimed. None of this looks dramatic. But cities change incrementally. Parking spread one lot at a time. It will recede the same way. What replaces parking matters. Removing parking without purpose creates voids. Successful transitions replace asphalt with housing, jobs, public space, active streets. Space must serve life, memory, and meaning. Cities are not machines. They are collective memory systems. When space is empty, memory fades. When space is active, meaning accumulates.
Parking interrupts that accumulation. The core insight. Parking did not happen by accident. It happened through design, policy, and belief. And what was designed can be redesigned. A different default. Imagine a city where parking exists, but does not dominate. Where arriving is easy, but staying is richer. Where land works as hard as the people who live on it. That future is not radical. It is simply intentional. For most of us, parking feels invisible. We only notice it when it's missing. But once you see it, really see it, it changes how cities make sense. Every empty lot raises a question. What was here before? What could be here next? So here's the conversation worth having. Should American cities keep dedicating their most valuable land to storing empty cars, or is it time to ask more from that space? Not a yes or no answer, just your perspective. Because the future of American cities isn't decided by cars alone. It's decided by what we choose to value.